it's my pleasure to introduce Marv Pincus, the monthly program chair, to introduce our speaker. Marv?
Thank you, Bill. I first met Amy Knight early last year when I attended a lecture by her at the Summit Library on her recent book at the time, Orders to Kill the Putin Regime and Political Murder. I was very impressed with her and the lecture, and when I was asked to be program chair, I thought it best to ask her to appear and present a lecture today, and she graciously agreed to do so. She is the author of more than 30 scholarly articles, 6 books on Russian history and politics. She's contributed frequently to the New York Review of Books, the Times Literary Supplement, the Daily Beast, Toronto Globe, and she is a former Woodrow Wilson Fellow. She also worked for many years as a Soviet-Russian affairs analyst at the US Library of Congress. She taught at the London School of Economics, Johns Hopkins, and universities in Ottawa. She's received a bachelor's degree in Russian studies from University of Michigan and a master's and a PhD in Russian politics from London School of Economics. In fact, the New York Times indicated that she is the West's foremost scholar of the KGB. Her lecture today is very topical. She is going to speak on Putin, what he's done to Russian dissidents, and his role and implications on US political elections. Amy, it's all yours.
Thank you, Marvin. I am very honored to be asked to speak in front of Summit Old Guard. I would add, and thank you for offering a little bit of my resume. You might be interested that looking back on my career, one of the main reasons that I not only studied Russia, but also focused on the KGB and the security services in Russia, is that when I was a student at the University of Michigan in the summer of 1967, we went on a study tour to the Soviet Union. And that was not a great time in the sense that it was at the height of the Cold War. And we were told not to talk to Russians and so on and so forth. But of course, being a 21-year-old who defied orders, I, along with some of my fellow students, got together with some quote unquote dissident Russian students. And I ended up being arrested and held overnight at the local KGB headquarters in Kiev. So that I was just fascinated. The KGB officers who arrested me, I knew I wasn't gonna. They had nothing to keep me on, and but they were very interested in what kind of a car my father had, and I was giving them Marlboro cigarettes, and it was. I look back on it, and anyway, it was quite an experience, and I think that may be one reason that I've continued to have an interest in the Russian security services. Anyway, so there's been a lot of news about coronavirus, and as a result, we don't really focus as much on global news and world news. I've noticed that a lot. So I think that now might be a good time, particularly with the new Biden administration coming in January, to look at current Russia. How did Putin become Russia's president? Is Putin firmly in power? What kind of Russia does the Biden administration face? I should remind you that it's very important for us to keep Russia in mind, for us in the United States, if no other reason than because of Russia's vast nuclear arsenal. With approximately 6,800 nuclear warheads, Russia has the largest stockpile of nuclear weapons in the world. So, who is Mr. Putin? Paul? This is, Putin was a relatively unknown figure when Boris Yeltsin appointed him prime minister in August of 1999. And this is a quote from one journalist. Under normal circumstances, Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin might today be a track-suited personal security guard for one of the many oligarchs who in fact live and breathe and luxuriate at his pleasure. Short, bald, and with an almost reptilian gait, the former KGB case officer never seemed destined for anything other than a bit player in the never-ending Russia tragedy. Thanks, Paul. Putin's parents were of humble origin with scant education. Their forebears were actually serfs. They married in 1928 when they were both 17 and moved to Leningrad a few years later. During World War II, Putin's father, Vladimir, served in an NKVD battalion behind German lines, and he was seriously wounded. After the war, he worked as a tool maker in a Leningrad factory that made subway and railway cars. Their son, Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, was born in 1952, when his mother, who had barely survived the siege of Leningrad, was almost 41. Putin's two brothers, born earlier, had both died of illness, so Putin was raised as an only child. After the ravages of war, life for Soviet citizens was something they clung to rather than took for granted. The Putins doted on their only child. Putin's ex-wife, Ludmila, later observed that, quote, he was their sun, moon, and stars. Putin was small in stature. Right now, he's 5 foot 5 inches as an adult. And he took up martial arts as a boy. The martial arts transformed his, judo in particular, transformed his life, giving him the means of asserting himself against larger, tougher boys. Putin would cultivate a macho image of physical fitness and athletic prowess well into his reign as Russia's leader. Toward the end of his secondary school years, Putin decided that he wanted to become a spy. Inspired by the 1968 Russian film Sword and Shield, which glorified the KGB's predecessors, Putin walked into the Leningrad KGB headquarters and asked how he could join the KGB. He was told that the KGB did not hire walk-ins and that he should get more education. As a Russian journalist later observed, imagine a boy who dreams of being a KGB officer when everyone else wants to be a cosmonaut. A law degree was a path for a job in the KGB, particularly for the counterintelligence and domestic security branch. So 2 years later, in 1970, Putin entered the law faculty at Leningrad State University. Soviet law was a political weapon of the state and the Communist Party, and it was used to buttress the regime, not to protect legal rights. In addition to the KGB, law students in those days ended up pursuing careers in regular law enforcement and prosecutor's office. In short, Putin gained his higher education at a bastion of Brezhnevian communist dogma rather than an institution offering intellectual enlightenment. In his third year at Leningrad State University, Putin was able to express a non-ideological pleasure, driving his own car. Paul? This was a Soviet-made Zaporozhets. His mother, by a stroke of incredible luck, won the car in a lottery. In Putin's own words, quote, money was tight in our family, and to give the car to me was an absolute madness. We could have sold it after all, and gotten at least 3,500 rubles for it. But my parents decided to spoil me. Thanks, Paul. Putin joined the KGB in Leningrad in 1975, becoming a rank and file officer. He eventually moved to the Foreign Intelligence Service and was posted to Dresden in East Germany, where he witnessed the fall of the Berlin Wall. This made a huge impression on him, as he later talked about in his reminiscences. After 1991, Putin returned to what became St. Petersburg and worked in the mayor's office. There, he enriched himself and other friends through lucrative government contracts. Putin was actually in charge of licensing St. Petersburg's foreign exports, and this was a huge source of money that was often, I should just say, he was later accused of corruption at that time, but he managed to avoid any charges. In 1996, Putin moved to the Kremlin, where he was one of those responsible for the Kremlin's property abroad. This was another sinecure that enabled him to earn some money and get some more allies. In 1998, he was appointed chief of the FSB, which is the successor agency to the KGB. And then in August 1999, President Yeltsin, who was rapidly failing in health and had lost much of his popular support, appointed Putin prime minister. Now, why did he do this? I think that the easiest answer is that Putin, as FSB chief, had all the files on corruption by Yeltsin and his family and his close inner circle. So this was a sort of a Faustian bargain. Putin was not going to prosecute Yeltsin after he stepped down from power. The oligarchs also supported Putin's candidacy for president in 2000. I should say that Yeltsin formally stepped down at the end of 1999, and Putin was then elected president in March of 2000. Another thing that actually gave Putin some recognition, because he really was relatively unknown to most Russians, was in September 1999, there were these apartment bombings in Russia, which I'm sure you probably remember. It was a horrific thing that happened, and thousands of people died. It was blamed in particular by Putin on Chechen terrorists, and then he started the war in Chechnya, and this kind of catapulted him to popularity and recognition. So, Paul, slide. It took a while before people understood that Putin was the complete antithesis of a Democrat. Even Bill Browder, who's the author of that book, Red Notice, which you are probably familiar with, praised Putin publicly until he was expelled from Russia in 2005. Putin rolled back on democratic reforms introduced in the Yeltsin era and began clamping down on the independent media. So now elections have become meaningless because the Kremlin's United Russian Party is usually able to block all other candidates. The state-controlled television spews out a constant stream of pro-Kremlin propaganda, and the independent media is suppressed by all sorts of restrictions, including sometimes arrests on bogus charges. Significantly, Putin installed his cronies from St. Petersburg, including from the former KGB, into key positions in the Kremlin. These men are called in Russian siloviki, which means strong men. These are people who come from the police, the security, and the military, and they pretty much dominate in Putin's government. Next slide, Paul. Paul, oh. So there's a picture, a photo of Putin meeting with his Siloviki. On the left, closest to us, is Alexander Bortnikov from St. Petersburg, who is head of the FSB. And next to him is Nikolai Patrushev, who used to be head of the FSB, both from St. Petersburg. Since Putin came to power in 2000, Russia has witnessed mounting violence against Putin's political opponents. Putin's allies controlled, as I said, the security services and the criminal investigative agencies, as they still do. So this has meant that when key Putin critics and political opponents are eliminated by murder or other acts of violence, Putin's men control the investigations. Thanks, Paul. So there are several prominent cases of political murder under Putin, and I'm just going to mention just a few of them. I've written about these in my book, and I think that they're the most important. In addition to their courage, these Russian victims of political murder had several things in common. They all made themselves personal enemies of Vladimir Putin. Paul? I love that photograph. I'm sure Putin doesn't. Thanks, Paul. Next slide. This is the award-winning journalist Anna Politkovskaya. She was gunned down in the stairwell of her apartment house in Moscow in October 2006. As a reporter for Novaya Gazeta, the independent Russian newspaper, Politkovskaya traveled more than 50 times to Chechnya, documenting the war there and the atrocities that were committed by the Russian military during the Second Chechen War, which Putin, as I mentioned, launched. Politkovskaya wrote in scathing terms about Putin. This is one thing that she said. I'll quote her. "Why do I dislike Putin? This is precisely why. I dislike him for a matter-of-factness worse than thievery, for his cynicism, for his racism, for his lies, for the massacre of innocents that went on throughout his first term." Next slide, Paul. This is another victim of the Kremlin and Putin. This is former FSB officer Alexander Lipfinenko, who was poisoned by polonium-210 in London a month after Politkovskaya was gunned down. So that was in November of 2006. Now, in November of 1998, while he was still an FSB officer, Litvinenko gave a scandalous television press conference announcing that the FSB, which Putin then headed, had asked him and his colleagues to kill Russian oligarch Boris Berezovsky. As a result of this press conference, Litvinenko was imprisoned, and he later fled Russia for England. In London, he became a fierce and relentless critic of the Kremlin, reporting on the Russian mafia and its ties to the Putin leadership. And in particular, he wrote about Putin. One thing that he said in the summer of 2006 was that Putin was actually a pedophile. A Russian observer said afterwards, quote, "I would think that if you say that Mr. Putin is a pedophile, it would make Mr. Putin mad, regardless of the fact whether he is a pedophile or not." So Litvinenko paid for his comments with his life. In February, next slide, please. In February 2015, Democratic politician Boris Nemtsov was shot to death on a bridge just outside Kremlin walls. Nemtsov was not only a leading member of the democratic opposition movement, who had organized the 2011-2012 protest movements against the Kremlin, he also published a series of reports about Putin, which documented the extensive corruption of Putin and his cronies. Perhaps more than anything else, what angered Putin was that Nemtsov was a vocal supporter of Western sanctions against Russia, and he traveled to Washington and elsewhere in favor of such laws as the Magnitsky Act, which you probably heard of, which had introduced sanctions against particular Russians for human rights abuses. In the eyes of the Kremlin, Nemtsov's actions were treasonous. Next slide, please, Paul. In March 2018, former GRU, which is military intelligence agent, Sergei Skripal was poisoned along with his daughter Yulia in the town of Salisbury, England. Putin probably did not even ever meet Sergei Skripal, but in his eyes, and remember he was a former foreign intelligence officer, Putin was, Skripal was a traitor. And in fact, Skripal had earlier admitted to having given the names of dozens of GRU agents to Britain's MI5, their foreign intelligence. And Skripal was caught and sent to prison. But in 2010, he was exchanged and in a spy swap with Russia. So he then arrived in England and was living in the town of Salisbury. This was where he and his daughter were poisoned in March of 2018. Now, all four of these victims knew that they were on the Kremlin's hit list, and they had received warnings. Politkovskaya, for example, had received death threats in 2001 when she was on a plane, 2004, when she was flying to the south of Russia to act as a negotiator with terrorists. She never made it. She ended up in the hospital, and she later said that it was the FSB that had poisoned her. Lipfinenko, who knew Politkovskaya personally, cautioned her the last time she visited London shortly before her murder that she was in danger, and he advised her not to return to Russia. But she insisted that she had a mission to report on human rights violations in her country. She was not going to give that up for her safety. Alexander Litvinenko also had forewarnings of his killing. After Politkovskaya's murder, he told a British consultant for whom he was doing contract work that he would be next. According to this consultant, Litvinenko was worried about himself, that there might be a list or that he would be on it. In fact, next photo, please, Paul. It later became known that this photo that you see here was used as a target at the firing ranges of Russia's MVD, or internal police troops. On the very day of his poisoning, thanks, Paul, Litvinenko received a direct warning from an associate with whom Litvinenko was working that he was in fact on a hit list. And Boris Nemtsov also was aware that he was a likely target of Putin's vengeance. According to Russian journalist Yevgeny Albats, Nemtsov was afraid of being killed, and he was trying to convince himself and me that they wouldn't touch him because he'd been a member of the Russian government and they wouldn't want to create a precedent. As for Sergei Skripal, the former GRU agent who was poisoned in Britain, when he was released from prison as part of this spy swap in 2010, Putin said publicly, "Traitors always come to a bad end." And later he referred to Skripal as, quote, "a scumbag and a traitor to the motherland." So Putin did not bother to hide his feelings of revenge against Mr. Skripal. Now, in the cases of Politkovskaya and Nemtsov, the investigations of their murders followed similar patterns. They were both killed within Russia. Suspects were rounded up and charged quickly, but the authorities never identified the masterminds, the people who ordered the killings. And this is because, as I noted before, Putin controls the investigative agencies. Now, because Lipfinenko was murdered on British soil, there was a proper investigation, although it was 9 years before the British High Court in London conducted an inquiry. In fact, if things had actually gone according to the plan of the Kremlin, the investigation and the inquiry would never have happened, because Lipfinenko was supposed to die right after he was poisoned with polonium-210. In fact, as we know, he survived in the hospital for 3 weeks, and doctors and scientists were able to identify the poisoning. And this polonium is very rare, and it's only produced in Russia under high security. Photo, please, Paul. So this is a photograph of the two men who actually administered the poison to Litvinenko. As Sir Robert Owen, the High Court judge, concluded after months of hearings, based on witness testimonies and a huge amount of documentation, the poison was administered to Litvinenko at the Pine Bar of the Millennium Hotel on November 1st, 2006, by these two gentlemen, Dmitry Kovtun on the left and Andrei Lugovoy on the right, who had been hired by the FSB. Lugovoy and Kovtun flew back to Moscow 2 days after the poisoning, and the Russian government refused to extradite them. Their motive was probably money, but they apparently didn't know how lethal the poison, the polonium, was, which they'd brought with them to London. They inadvertently left polonium traces everywhere they went and even contaminated themselves. As with the Litvinenko case, thanks, Paul, with the Skripals, there was this special poison, which is only produced at a Russian state laboratory, Novichok. The two Russians who carried out the attack with the help of a third one did a very sloppy job. They were seen on video cameras in Britain while they were there in the country, and Novichok was found in their hotel room. Both of them had used false passports, but their identity was soon discovered. Both of these gentlemen are, photo please, Paul. Those are the two, these are GRU officers, and they're the gentlemen who put Novichok, they believe, on the actual doorknob of Skripal's house. And it's so lethal that he and his daughter became very, very ill and almost died. Thanks, Paul. In his report on the Litvinenko case, Sir Robert Owen was equivocal about Putin's role, saying only that the head of the FSB and Vladimir Putin probably approved the killing. But these men would not have acted on their own initiative, and no one in the FSB would have ordered them to kill Litvinenko without Putin's approval. The same can also be said with the Skripal case. There's no doubt that this could never have been done without getting a nod from the Kremlin leader. So we can finally dismiss such talk as someone did it maybe to please Putin or without him knowing beforehand, or even worse, as some people, the standard Kremlin line is, these murders could not have been ordered by Putin because it was so harmful to his stature as a leader. In fact, Putin, I think, was pleased to have people suspect that he'd ordered these attacks because they serve as a warning to other critics and they intimidate them. In fact, back home in Russia, where many people accepted that the Kremlin had ordered Litvinenko's murder, this was almost a good thing. Lipfinenko was viewed as a traitor who deserved to be punished. He was viewed kind of as and Lugovoy was viewed as a hero. This would explain why Lugovoy was elected to the Russian parliament and received an award from Putin himself. So now I'm going to come to a much more recent and very terrible episode, which is the poisoning of Alexander Navalny. Paul? Alexei Navalny, not Alexander. Alexei Navalny is a famous Russian opposition politician. He's 44 years old. Over the past 5 or 6 years, he's been campaigning against the Putin regime and exposing the Kremlin's corruption on social media. He has millions of Russians who view his YouTube exposés about Russian officials and their ill-gotten gains. And he also has appeared frequently at anti-Kremlin rallies to urge his thousands of supporters to fight for democracy. While flying from the Siberian city of Tomsk to Moscow on August 20th, 2000 of this year, after several days of campaigning for candidates in local elections, Navalny fell violently ill. The plane's pilot made an emergency landing in Omsk, where Navalny was rushed to a local hospital and placed in a medically induced coma. Emergency room doctors immediately suspected that Navalny had been poisoned with a nerve agent, and they treated him with something called atropine, which works against these toxins. But Omsk officials actually later denied that Navalny had been poisoned. After 2 days in Omsk, Navalny was flown by an air ambulance to Berlin in Germany, where he was treated at the Charité hospital by specialists who subsequently determined that he had indeed been poisoned with a nerve agent, and that this nerve agent was one of military grade known as Novichok, which is the same nerve agent that was used with Sergei Skripal. It is produced only by the Russian state. Their findings were confirmed by specialists from Sweden and France, as well as by the Hague-based Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, the OPCW. After regaining consciousness on September 7th, Navalny remained in the hospital until September 22nd, when he was discharged to an undisclosed location in Germany for further rehabilitation. Not surprisingly, the Kremlin has refused to initiate a criminal investigation of the incident, which occurred, after all, in Russia. And instead, they've offered alternative theories about what happened to Navalny. In a September phone call to French President Emmanuel Macron, Putin suggested that Navalny may have poisoned himself, while authorities in Omsk said that Navalny had suffered an attack of pancreatitis. In early November, the chief of Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service said that it was possible that Western security services had poisoned Navalny in order to make Russia look bad. And meanwhile, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov speculated that Navalny had been poisoned after his arrival in Germany. At a 2-day conference of the OPCW, the Organization for Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, just this past week, delegates from more than 50 countries, including the United States, condemned the attack on Navalny in the strongest possible terms. And the German delegation called on Russia to cooperate fully with the organization and disclose what it knows about the circumstances of the poisoning. The Russian delegation responded by accusing Germany of its allies of unleashing a mass disinformation campaign against Russia. There's little doubt that Western government leaders know full well that Putin has ordered these attacks on his critics, both at home and abroad. but they don't always have a united response. In contrast to British leaders who've not hesitated to blame the Kremlin for the Skripal poisoning, Donald Trump ignored the evidence. And more recently, Trump has never even mentioned Alexei Navalny. Picture, please, photo, please, Paul. Trump even has said of Putin, quote, "Nobody's ever proven that he's killed anyone. He, Putin, has always denied it." Trump seems to find in Putin a kindred spirit. He admires Putin for his toughness as a leader and for his apparent firm grip on power. But Putin is no friend to the West, and it's hugely important that Western governments call him to account, not only for political murders abroad, but also in his own country. Diplomatic and economic sanctions are valuable tools as a response to these acts. Even though the average Russian is unlikely to stop supporting Putin because of these murders, sanctions do have serious consequences for the Russian economy. And these sanctions ultimately have a negative effect on the standard of living of most Russians. In addition to pursuing nuclear arms agreements with Russia, the Biden administration, and that would include START, the nuclear arms treaty that is about to expire. And this is something that the Putin administration will have to address right away. The Biden administration will have to address right after Biden becomes president, because that treaty, the START treaty, expires in February. Biden will also, thanks, Paul. Biden will also face another problem, and that is what to do about 3 Americans who are under arrest in Russia right now. The first is American financier Michael Calvi, who was arrested in February 2019 on bogus fraud charges. He spent some time in prison, but then he was released put under house arrest, and just recently he was released from house arrest, but he's still under restrictions. His trial has not yet occurred. Then you've probably heard of Paul Wayland, a former Marine who was arrested in December 2018 on charges of spying against Russia. And then there was 29-year-old Trevor Reed, also a former Marine, who was arrested in July 2019 on charges of assaulting a policeman. Whalen was just recently sentenced to 16 years behind bars, and he's now in Moldova at a labor colony that's part of this former Stalinist gulag. Whalen, it was clearly a setup job. I don't have time to go into the details, but he was handed something that he thought was just photographs from a friend, and the Russian friend, actually worked for the FSB, and Whalen was accused of spying against Russia. And Reed had apparently gone to visit his girlfriend in Moscow and got very drunk at a party, and he was running out into the street. So his girlfriend called the police, and they arrived and took him to the police station. Later claimed that on the way to the police station, Trevor Reed had assaulted one of the policemen in the car. And so he was given a 9-year prison sentence. Interestingly enough, they apparently never handcuffed Reed. He was clearly out of control drunk, and there were no video cams in the car. So there's no proof that he assaulted a policeman. So the Russians are clearly using these people as pawns, and they want the United States to exchange them for at least a couple of Russians who really are criminals that are now incarcerated in the US. So it will be interesting to see what Biden does. Now, I don't have too much time left, so I will try to cover this as quickly as possible. You might be wondering how strong Putin's leadership is in Russia and how much support he actually has. In July of this year, there was a Russian vote on a constitutional amendment, which would allow Mr. Putin to serve 2 additional terms as president after this term expires in 2024. So that amendment was passed, but it's not clear that these votes actually reflect the will of the people and the extent to which they actually do support Putin. There are actually some important developments which could threaten the stability of Putin's regime. The first, of course, could I have a slide, Paul? The first is the coronavirus pandemic, which has been the main factor in a deterioration of the already not very favorable socioeconomic situation in Russia, primarily due to the fall of their gross domestic product. It was 4.7% in October. And the continual decline in the real disposable income of citizens. So the pandemic has made this situation a lot worse. And it has accelerated. Next photo. There's a photo of Putin when he went to a hospital early on in the pandemic. And since then, he's been holed up in his residence outside Moscow, and he doesn't appear before the people publicly, which doesn't exactly give the best impression. As of December 5th, there were 30,000 new coronavirus cases in Russia per day. Russia already has 2.5 million cases, and it has the 4th highest number of coronavirus cases in the world. Daily records are being set for the numbers of new cases and deaths. Because of the failure to invest in the outlying regions of Russia, the healthcare systems there are very backward, and they are overwhelmed by cases of the virus. Now, vaccinations they have a new vaccine, the so-called Sputnik 5 vaccine. And people in Moscow have started to be vaccinated. But this vaccine was rushed, and it hasn't been subjected to the kind of rigorous testing that we require here. So there are a lot of doubts about its effectiveness and the possibility that it could be harmful. In a new poll, 59% of respondents said that they would actually not be vaccinated. Thanks, Paul. So it's quite clear that since the pandemic, the approval rating of Putin has declined. I'll just give you an example. This is according to a poll by a very respected center called Levada in Russia. In December of 2017, 58% of Russians thought that the country was moving in the right direction, and only 28% thought that Russia was declining. In November of 2020, only 48%, so that's a decline by 10%, of the people thought Russia was moving in the right direction. And 43% considered Russia to be declining in terms of its overall situation. As for Putin's personal approval rating, in December of 2017, it was a whopping 82%. By November of 2020, it had fallen to 65%. Now, to those of us in the West, I should say that these approval ratings still seem pretty good, right? But for a lot of complicated reasons, these polls, I don't think, are actually reflect a deep support for Mr. Putin. And I'll just quickly elaborate a little bit upon that. It's interesting that in the public opinion on the Navalny poisoning, which I found some data on, it seems that the poisoning, and this is the poisoning that just happened in August, this did not really affect Russians very much. This is mainly because of the television propaganda, and television is state owned, and so there's no room for independent views. And of course, the propaganda on television was to deny Kremlin involvement and to accuse Navalny of being a foreign agent. So Russians who watch this day in and day out kind of believe it. And also there's almost a kind of a level of indifference sometimes on the part of the population. Only 18 respondents in a Levada Center poll said that they had closely followed the story of the poisoning. Only 59% said, quote, that they'd heard something about it. Now, this kind of insensitivity to such an extraordinary event is similar to what Russians expressed when the Malaysian airline was shot down over Ukraine in 2014. The Russians actually were responsible for that. People just didn't seem to care in Russia. And even with the case of the Skripal poisonings, Russian public opinion, by and large, was indifferent and followed the versions of the Russian government. But, and this is the big but, this does not mean that Russians are indifferent to politics. And I will cite a recent example, which is the protests in the Siberian region of Khabarovsk. And these protests, which started this summer, revealed the ability of civil society to actually mobilize on a single platform. And this platform has turned into a real political issue. Slide, please, Paul. These are the citizens who are protesting in the thousands, tens of thousands. The protests began on July 11th, 2020, in support of the governor of Khabarovsk, Sergei Furgal, who was not a member of Putin's United Russia Party. And he was arrested on unsubstantiated criminal charges and replaced by a Putin appointee. So this, the Kremlin clearly underestimated what the public reaction would be. And these protests, as I said, in the tens of thousands, have actually spread to other Siberian cities, and they've been a cause of serious concern for the Kremlin because they're continuing to this day. Now, it's important to note that these protests aren't organized by the opposition from Moscow. They reflect local problems, and they speak of civic cohesion, local solidarity. Their social base is not limited to urban educated middle classes. The share of those who sympathize with such protests among the general population is very high. So this, I think, could be said to reflect that there is a high degree of dissatisfaction with authorities, especially at the federal level. The protests, thank you, Paul. The protests in Belarus against the regime of the autocrat Alexander Lukashenko, who has ruled the country. Next photo, please. This is a picture of Alexander Lukashenko. He's ruled the country since Belarus was part of the Soviet Union. The protests which erupted this summer are another grave threat to the Kremlin. And they're continuing with mass arrests and imprisonments. They've drawn huge numbers. And the protests show no signs of letting up. Now, Moscow, watching the confrontation between the authoritarian regime of Belarus and the awakened civil society, has not yet found a candidate that could possibly replace Lukashenko. And in these conditions, where the country of Belarus is actually undergoing, which could be called a civil war, the Kremlin apparently has been forced to support Lukashenko out of fears of a possible spread of the Belarus protest movement, or the infection of Belarus, to Russia. For the advanced strata of Russian society and a significant part of young Russians, the Belarusian Velvet Revolution, which we could call it, is an attractive example of a disciplined, peaceful protest, possibly worthy of replication in moments of confrontation with the authorities. And the same can be said of the Khabarovsk protest. In terms of triggers, motives, involvement of broad social groups, and its generally peaceful nature, both the protests in Belarus and in Khabarovsk are quite similar. So Russian observers have started to wonder how likely it is that the Belarusian scenario might occur in Russia itself in 2024, when Putin comes up for re-election. By that time, I should say, the period of his actual rule will reach a quarter of a century, if you count from his appointment as prime minister in 1999. Now, Putin has always sort of wrested his power, in addition to the fact that he has his allies in all the organs of coercion, the police and the military and the security services. Putin has sort of rested his support on three pillars. First of all, the general indifference of the population, a kind of social contract, which says we citizens don't interfere in your affairs, and you provide us with minimal social guarantees and do not meddle in our affairs. Secondly, there's a kind of axiomatic view that there are no alternatives to Putin. And thirdly, since the autocrat, Mr. Putin, is still supported by the majority, then there's kind of a logic of crowd psychology. Why not join the majority? Now, this support and this majority, I think is disintegrating. A fundamentally new phenomenon can be observed, and that is that electoral behavior, which is mechanical ritual voting, often with no choice of candidates, doesn't really coincide with real sentiments. It doesn't reflect the dissatisfaction with the quality of public services and the socioeconomic situation in Russia that a lot of people feel. The regime's support, which is primarily from these polls that are, which request people to talk about how they feel about the regime, and these elections, this support, I think, is actually a lot softer than people might assume. Elections are a sort of artificial mobilization. And after the peak of this mobilization, and there are these elections, this artificial majority can kind of disintegrate. And the Khabarovsk case is a good example. Some of the very people who voted for the amendment that gave Putin 2 more terms after 2024, some of the very people in the Khabarovsk territory, where almost 63% of residents supported this amendment, which would extend Putin's rule. These people took to the streets with anti-Putin slogans just a short time later. So I think this is a good example of the fact that we can't always assume that Putin's support is so strong. Now, I don't have time at this moment to go into much more detail about the reaction in the West to Navalny and his poisoning. I should say that he appeared before the Russian parliament. Do you want to quickly show that slide, Paul? Just a couple weeks ago, and Navalny speaks English, and he did a very good job, and he urged members of the Russian parliament to not necessarily sanction the exact officials who were responsible for his poisoning, but Navalny is advocating sanctioning these wealthy oligarchs who park their yachts in off the coast of Spain and all over Europe and put their assets, their financial assets in Europe. And he was trying to urge the Europeans to sanction these people, freeze their assets, and have travel bans. Because even though these rich oligarchs aren't directly responsible to these crimes that I've described, they support Putin. And they're very important to Putin. So this was what Navalny was urging. And I think that I would say one more thing about Navalny. And can you show the photo of him? This is my final. That's a photograph of Navalny a couple of weeks ago. He is planning, this courageous Russian oppositionist is in Germany with his wife, who is absolutely lovely. And they are planning on returning to Russia, no matter what. He's not going to be one of these immigrants who remains abroad and talks about how bad Putin is. He's going back to his country to campaign, which takes an awful lot of courage. But he is waiting. He still has some numbness in one leg. And so he's getting a little bit more of that physical rehabilitation. So this is a photograph that he posted on Instagram a couple of weeks ago as he announced that he was about to start jogging again for the first time. And this is what he said, quote, "I'll let you know how it goes. You should start running too. If they poison you with chemicals, maybe it will save your life as well." So this is Navalny with his amazing sense of humor, his sense of irony. I know that I've mentioned that the majority of Russians still are far removed from Navalny, but he was, at one time, he ran for the Moscow mayoral post in 2013, and he did actually pretty well. He put up a strong fight. Since then, so many criminal charges have been leveled against him. He's been put in jail numerous times. And so the Kremlin won't let him actually register as a candidate in any of their elections. But he still has a lot of influence, and he's got a lot of charisma. So I hope that he will go back and be very safe, and that he'll be able to connect more with the Russian people. That's it.
Thank you, Marv.
Thank you, Amy. This is John Mejeda. I'm one of the co-hosts here. The talk was wonderful. It was informative and very interesting. We are going to go into a question and answer period now. If you would like to ask a question, please raise your blue hand, and I see already some hands are raised. There are some ground rules here. Please keep your questions short and refrain from expressing long opinions. Both the visitors and members can ask questions. We'll give the priority at the beginning to the members. So the first question will be from Herb Waddell. Let me unmute you, Herb. Okay, Herb.
He's still muted. Here. Oop.
John, go
Yes?
on to the next person, and Herb, you can come back to Herb.
Okay. We will go to Rich Yeager.
Ian Lutz.
Rich Jager's unmuted.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Amy. Do you see a most likely path that would lead to Russia becoming less of an autocratic, oligarchic society? I see what happens in Belarus, as you mentioned, and that seems to be going nowhere. is there a likely path to a better government in Russia? Thank you.
Well, that's a good question, and I would only say that you know, the things that I've talked about, the soft support for Putin, and the possibility that now, I mean, I of course I don't wish economic suffering on the part of the average Russian, but the point is that there is so much corruption at the top, and average Russians don't get to share in any of the Kremlin's wealth. So I would assume, and of course, the best would be a peaceful transition, that gradually the kind of things that I've talked about, these peaceful protests will grow, and they will be encouraged and supported by people like Mr. Navalny. And gradually, more people will get elected to the Russian parliament who don't represent Putin's party, United Russia. So I foresee that this would be a kind of a gradual phenomenon. And the only thing that we in the West can do, we can't go in and change Russia, but we can do these things like I just mentioned, you know, sending a message to these wealthy oligarchs who, you know, they're all over London. They have houses they own property in the United States, and they, you know, Oleg Deripaska, an oligarch who's so closely tied to Putin. We need to at least send a message that we're not hypocrites, and that's just something. And I think that the most important thing for the West to do is to strengthen the NATO alliance. I'm sorry, for the new Biden administration to do. This is the one thing, and Putin has said it publicly, that he views as a huge threat, a united NATO. So whatever policies we advocate, they should be together with our European allies. And I think that's very important.
Thank you.
Mike Martin?
Yeah, Amy, thank you for the presentation. One anomaly I've observed about Putin's behavior is that apparently he's a strong and, I guess, practicing Russian Orthodox Christian. He has been basically, how would you say, promoting freedom of religion, and apparently the Russian Orthodox, I don't know, bishop or whoever heads the church supports this. Is this a ruse, or is there some fact? And second point, does that suggest that Putin, if you know he aligns himself with traditional Russian religion, is more of a shadow of the Tsar than he is of Stalin? Thank you.
Wow. I think he's more a shadow of Stalin. I find it hard to believe. Yes, Putin does profess to be religious, and he gets a lot of political support from the Russian Orthodox Church. And I'm sure there's a lot of money that's passed back and forth. But it is not even me being cynical to say that this is all a show. It's just another way of, that Putin uses. He's very good at kind of portraying, as I said, he has this macho image and then this deeply religious image. But nobody who orders the murders of innocent people like Putin has done could possibly really be religious.
Okay, thank you.
Ian Lutas?
Yes, thank you, Amy, for a very interesting presentation. My question is, in spite of Russia's behavior that you've described this morning, plus interference in our 2016 election, and no doubt attempts to interfere in this year's election, along with other negative behavior towards the U.S., do you have any thoughts about why the U.S.'s response to Russia has been so weak and almost non-existent in the face of these very, very serious actions that Russia has taken?
Well, I think, first of all, you're right that the U.S. response at the highest level, i.e., President Trump, has been and the State Department has been very weak. I don't, one reason, the obvious reason, is that President Trump doesn't like to admit that Russia interfered in our elections, and that's why he's gone to such great lengths to demonstrate that the whole Russia investigation was a hoax. So I think that the most obvious reason is precisely that President Trump and his supporters like to think and portray the notion that there was no interference and that Trump was elected in 2016 on just purely because he was so popular. So I think that's the main reason why there's been so little response. And of course, the other reason is that cyber warfare is very, very complicated. And I know we have highly skilled people who monitor this, the NSA, the National Security Agency, so on and so forth. I mean, there are ways that we can respond. And some of those ways are not known to the general population. But I think that other countries have faced a similar problem, by the way. France, for example, and some of the Baltic countries have had a lot of bad things done by hackers from Russia. And it's a difficult battle to wage from the Western standpoint because it gets complicated.
Okay, Ron Haug.
Thank you, Amy, for an excellent presentation. My question is, the Russian people have been ruled by autocrats for centuries, going back to the days of the czars and the tsarinas. Are they psychologically ready to be ruled in a democratic form of government, or do they psychologically require an autocratic form of government?
Sorry, your question, I had a little trouble hearing you, was whether or not the oligarchs would like a democratic form of government?
No, whether the Russian people themselves would want a democratic form of government, or do they psychologically require an autocratic form of government because that's what they've had for centuries and that's what they've been used to.
That's a very good point, and I did not mention that one of the reasons why, and this is not just my idea, but other people think this, that one of the reasons why Putin's popularity even now is still at 62% is that people in Russia are kind of taught to venerate a leader. And you're right that the centuries of having a czar have made them more receptive to the idea of having this man in power who is not threatened and can lead Russia through all of its problems and crises. So yes, they do want a strong leader, but I also think that most Russians want to be able to influence their government, and they want to be able to have their vote count. And particularly the fact that they're suffering so much economically, more democratic change in that country would give them an opportunity maybe to start asking questions about where all this Russian money at the top goes. So I think there are two different feelings that are operating there.
Thank you.
Bill Tittle.
Yes. There's a great history of wonderful literature, Pushkin, music, Tchaikovsky, and so forth. Is there any independent literary output in Russia today?
Oh, yes, absolutely. in fact, I was just sent there's a Russian writer named Sergei Lebedev, and he's young and he's written some terrific novels. Unfortunately, I don't have a lot of time to read Russian novels, but I know that Russia still has a very prolific and excellent culture where, writers can really flourish. And, we're not talking the Stalin period. There are also excellent journalists who are able to express themselves. I use as the basis for a lot of my research this media outlet, radio station, but it's also online with the media blogs and so forth, called Echo of Moscow. And their people, they say just about everything, and they're very astute, and they can say what they think. So it's not like the Stalin period where people like Solzhenitsyn were expelled, or the Brezhnev period. Russians do have the freedom to develop culturally, and there is a lot of talent.
Bill, do we have time for any other questions? It's 11:35 now. Maybe one or so questions. It's up to you. Yeah, I know we have.
Amy, are you willing to stay on for another 10 minutes?
I can stay on for 5 minutes if you don't mind.
Okay, there you go.
All right, Herr Waddell, we'll try you again.
Oh, yes. Very interesting thought. Thank you. It's good to hear that a system which is dominated by oligarchs and corrupt politicians with control of the press, even control of the electoral process, still has a popular movement, and you think that there's a likelihood that it might prevail eventually. Do you think we have the same good outlook in America?
About Russia?
About a system like that, wherever it may be.
Well, I'm not going to get into our politics.
You
but
did.
I should remind all of you that it wasn't that long ago. It was 1991 when the Soviet edifice completely collapsed, and nobody would have been able to predict that. So one just does, and it was peaceful by and large. And so I think that it's important to remember that that this can always happen again. And interestingly enough, most experts would agree that what did cause the disenchantment with Gorbachev and the August coup, where you saw Yeltsin standing up there, he became the big hero. This democratic revolution there's no question that it was caused mainly by the fact that people were so bad off economically. And so, I mean, look at Russia now is not doing well. Oil prices have gone way down. The ruble has declined. They haven't invested in their infrastructure. So the fact that all of these wealthy Putin allies and oligarchs and security people, they've become super wealthy, but they've become wealthy at the expense of the average Russian. And I think if things continue this way, I would expect that Russians will become more politically conscious.
Thank you. That was a very, very encouraging answer.
Okay, we'll have one last question from Don Goldberg. Don, you need to unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you for a great presentation, Amy. And two quick questions. During Putin's time in the KGB, did he have work with the Stasi in East Germany? And on an unrelated matter, some analysts or commentators have said that Putin may in fact be the wealthiest person in the world because of the level of corruption, and that a lot of these oligarchs were buying $60 million penthouses in New York City are really just shills for him. Any comment about that?
Well, I don't know about the oligarchs being shields, but you're right. I mean, these oligarchs are all over the place, and you know, the West, I guess, the Western governments kind of like their money being invested. But as far as, sorry, what was your first question?
During his time in the KGB, did he have operational connectedness with the Stasi?
Yeah, absolutely. Their local KGB office worked together with the Stasi. And we have a lot of evidence. It's fascinating, actually, in Putin's biographies and original testimonies. Putin was, you know, very involved with the Stasi. So this is, you know, his whole experience in Dresden is something that I think really had a big influence on him. And of course, he was not happy about the fact that the Berlin Wall came down. So.
Thank you.
All right, I thank you, Amy. Thank you for appearing today. It was much appreciated and very educational. We have two ways to thank our speakers. First way is by giving you a certificate. John, do you have that to show?
I'm getting it.
Or Paul?
John's going to do it.
All right, that's the certificate of appreciation that
Thank you.
we will be sending to you. As you could see on the lower left, in 1930 or so, Summit was the orchid capital of the East, and that's the symbol on our certificate. And we thank you very much. And the second way, of course, if you were speaking in person at our meeting, we would all be standing up and applauding you. So if we could all just show
Thank you, and I'd like to thank you, Mark, for enlisting me to do this, and Paul Tukey for giving me a lot of his time with the technical support. Thanks very much, guys.